They help us to discern meaningful signals in the general noise of time. They attune us to transcendent measures, help us to order our souls to goodness and decency. They give us hope. And they give us consolation, even if it's only the consolation of insight. But I think the most important thing about the humanities is that they are an inexhaustible source of personal and cultural vitality. Saul Bellow wrote that writers send an electrical current of imagination through the fact. And of course, this is exactly what poetry does, what dramatists do, novelists, art. You can think of Rembrandt's depictions of the near sacrifice of Isaac, putting himself in the position of Isaac and Abraham, trying to think what they were thinking and feel what they were feeling. But it's also true of history, which takes what would otherwise be sort of dead facts, evidence, and practices what's been aptly described as prophecy in reverse by trying to bring them to life, to explain. It's what philosophers do when they explore the ultimate questions. It's what the Bible does when it gives voice to the first things. And this intellectual, moral, and spiritual act of imagination that's at the heart of the humanities gives life, and it also saves life. And that's why I think, again, the humanities are among the most precious of the accumulated riches of the past. Salvador Dali, who was a tremendously innovative and original artist, once paradoxically said that everything that is not tradition is plagiarism. And the reason, he said, is because only art that is nourished by the blood of reality, by which I think he sort of meant the richly oxygenated life of the tradition, can be truly original. In his autobiography, Black Boy, the American author Richard Wright said that reading Dostoevsky and Flaubert and Tolstoy, Mark Twain, Theodore Dreiser, and many other authors gave him nothing less than a sense of life itself as he attempted to flee the Jim Crow South. Admiral James Stockton wrote that studying the Stoics at Stanford helped him to survive more than 7 years in the notorious North Vietnamese prison camp that the inmates called the Hanoi Hilton. There's a very fine essay by Jonathan Rose called Classics in the Slums, in which he includes testimonials from early 20th century workers in England, colliers, laundresses, and the like, who were kindled to the point of explosion by reading great books made available to them by the Workers' Educational Association. They had these libraries. And so he actually records certain conversations, in the coal mines. And one guy would say, me and Pope do get along. And the other fellow would say, no, you want to read Shelley. That's real poetry, And I think those kinds of anecdotes show that to study the humanities is to enter into a community of the word, right? That's open to everyone. So in his famous letter to Vittorio, Machiavelli writes that at the end of a long day, negotiating timber sales and so forth, he would shed his muddy clothes, enter the study, and enter the ancient courts of ancient men and be received with affection. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that he would summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul he would, and they would all come graciously, with no scorn or condescension. I think that the great books come freely and gladly when they're called, and they don't judge us in advance. And I think we should return the favor. Schopenhauer once said that we should approach works of art as we would approach a prince, right? And I think what he said applies to great books as well. Treat the work of art like a prince. Let it speak first. Dostoevsky, like the really greatest writers, brings together imagination in all of these various modes: literary, philosophical, religious, historical. First of all, it's an extraordinary work of literature. There are scenes in the book that combine comedy and pathos, tragedy, in ways that are unsurpassed in any other novel. And it's also a deeply philosophical dramatization of the consequences of sort of the human consequences of certain philosophical ideas, particularly those of German absolute idealism, the work of Fichte, Hegel, the dialectic of the master and slave plays a great part, and of course, Marx. Richard Pavere wrote in his introduction to Demons, he said, what are the demons in this book? And his very helpful suggestion, although I don't think it's absolutely complete, is that the demons are these isms, you know, materialism, Marxism, socialism, these ideas that have disastrous consequences when people attempt to live by them. It's deeply historically informed. You know, Dostoevsky was really quite a prophet, and Solzhenitsyn said that he alone foresaw totalitarianism of the writers in the 19th century. In Demons, there is a prophecy. One of the characters calls for 100 million heads in order to bring the solution to the riddle of history into being. This is a Marxist formulation. And that's roughly the total, according to the Black Book of Communism, of the number of people killed within the communist regimes themselves, citizens of these regimes during the 20th century. It has profound political wisdom. Dostoevsky understood that politics is not a problem in a sort of mathematical sense, and therefore it doesn't have a solution. It doesn't have a permanent solution. The sort of impatient, modern love affair with revolutionary politics seeks permanent solutions. And Dostoevsky shows us that any political solution in that sense is a final solution. He's profoundly attuned to religious longings, to myth, to the spirit, the healing power of a genuine connection with an unseen world of the spirit. He's also profoundly attuned to the way that religious longings play out, even if religion as such has been repudiated, right? So he understands, and he shows in Demons, that socialist radical revolutionary politics is a kind of anti-Christianity. And he helps us to understand the figure of the Antichrist in this book. In fact, of course, Brothers Karamazov has the Grand Inquisitor, but the fullest and most charismatic portrayal of this kind of revolutionary Antichrist is in Demons. And finally, and maybe last but not least, I would say it's directly relevant to our contemporary situation. So in Demons, a group of young nihilistic socialists, and I should say, by the way, Demons shows that socialism is ultimately nihilism, runs riot in a town. They commit arson, they commit murder, they commit riot. And they're indulged by their elders, who are these liberal oligarchs, progressively minded oligarchs. In spite of their scandalous libertinism, their incendiary radicalism, their low and base pranks, they're indulged until the sort of horrible apocalyptic denouement by these elders. And the question really is why, you see, because it seems to me that this has a very strong parallel to our current situation. One reason is virtue signaling. These liberal and progressively minded elites believe that proximity to the newest radical progressive ideas will get them noticed in the highest circles of society in Petersburg, which was very progressive. Another is fear of cancellation. And this is really interesting. There's a scene in Demons where two of the main characters, rush off to Petersburg to participate and sort of make their name and show their powers in connection with the new progressivism. And they have a sort of salon, a literary salon, and people give speeches and so forth. And at one of these evenings, a relative of the hostess has an argument with a young man who's very rude, but very famous. And that old relative calls him a brat, right, and an atheist. And everyone wanted the hostess to kick this old relative out, which she didn't. Well, the local papers drew caricatures of her and her friend and caricatured them as retrograde reactionaries. They were canceled, in effect. And Dostoevsky grasps what is really painfully obvious today. And that is that as authority collapses and institutions implode and moral and intellectual anarchy prevails, that elite is apt to combine with these sort of young progressivist ideologues to unleash destructive forces that neither group is fully able to control. So I think it's a very timely novel, and it is arguably the greatest work of the greatest writer of the last few centuries. It's eminently worth studying.